As coalition talks stall and others break down in some hung municipalities, what happens come Thursday, the 18th of November? This is the deadline set for political parties to form coalition council. Here to talk to us about this and more, joined now by the editor of the Africa Governance Papers, Richard Jurgens, political analyst, Professor Steven Friedman, and Jaap de Visser, director at the Dullah Omar Institute. Gentlemen, good evening. Good to have you with us tonight here on In Focus. Let's start with, of course, the all-important question: will they meet deadline? And if they don't, what next? Richard?
Well, it's hard to say if they'll meet the deadline. It looks like there's a lot of game playing at the moment, seeking partners among the smaller parties for coalitions. It might take a long time. It's difficult to say whether they'll meet the deadline, I have to say.
Are we going for re-elections, and do they have appetite to do that? I mean, President Cyril Ramaphosa in that thank you gathering said, well, if it must be that way, then we'll go there.
I think one of the bigger questions is whether the voters have appetite for a rerun, looking at the low turnout of these elections. It's hard to say what would happen then. Possibly that even fewer people would turn out.
Yeah. Professor Friedman, will they meet deadline?
Well, Thabo, it's far more serious than that. No, they won't meet the deadline, and in many cases they won't form coalitions at all. I think Jaap would be better placed to tell you how that would work legally. But if you just, look, let's just set the scene here. We have a particular problem, right? The problem is, according to Mr. Holomisa, voters are looking for an alternative to the ANC. Our problem is they haven't found it. And by that I mean that although the ANC had its worst election ever by a considerable distance, it's still it got double the votes, more than double the votes of the Democratic Alliance. It got 4 times the votes of the EFF. And that means that in a lot of municipalities, the logical way to form a government would be for the biggest party, the ANC, to form governments with the other parties. But as we've just been hearing, the other parties don't want to form a coalition with the ANC. And that leaves us in a situation where the maths simply do not add up. By my calculation, I mean, I haven't looked at all the medium-sized municipalities. Of the metros, the opposition can cobble together a very small and fragile majority in Tshwane and Johannesburg. And that's it. They can't do it in any of the other metros. They can't do it in any of the other municipalities. So in those municipalities, you have a situation in which, under present circumstances, nobody can form a government. I must say that even before the EFF broke off from those talks with the ANC, and before most of the parties said they wouldn't work with the ANC, by my calculation, there were quite a few metros, Ekurhuleni, Nelson Mandela Bay being among them, where just with realistic politics you couldn't form a coalition at all. So we have this huge hole in our party politics, which is the absence of that which Mr. Holomisa is talking about, of a party which voters who are unhappy with the ANC can move to.
Other political parties, sorry, Prof.
Where indeed,
while you're on that question, other political parties,
in many cases,
sorry,
the alternative to an ANC government is no government. Sorry?
Yeah, I was asking, other political parties reading the voter properly here, that the voter said they must not work with the ANC?
No, of course not. I mean, that's, nobody goes into a ballot box and says, I'm voting for the UDM and the ACDP because I want them to form a coalition with X and X, Y, etc. Voters vote for the party they want to support, and those parties enter into coalitions to form a majority. If they don't want to form a coalition with the ANC, that's fine. That's their right. We're a democracy. I'm simply pointing out that that's not because their voters told them so. That's because they make certain calculations which suggest that is so. And what I'm saying is that the alternative to that is not some other coalition. The alternative to that is no coalition. Once again, I don't know all the legalities, but we could end up with the odd situation that in the most competitive election in our history, we'll end up with administrators, appointed officials running municipalities because nobody can form a government.
Yeah. Yep. Are we going for re-elections?
No, I don't think so. That's not as easy, I think, as the president made it out to be. Legally, it doesn't work that, when there's no coalition, that you can just sort of announce a re-election. A council can be dissolved for one of two reasons. One is if it dissolves itself by 2/3 majority. That's very unlikely to happen because then, you vote yourself out of a job. The other option is for a council to be dissolved by the province, but that would only come into play when there's real dysfunction and mayhem. So that's not immediately on the cards. We've seen it, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal in 2016. There was a municipality in Kutu that couldn't constitute a government, but it took about 6 months before it was dissolved. Because you dissolve a municipality or a council in response to governance chaos, and that would first then have to be manifest. But it's very likely if there's no government that is formed, and no decisions can be taken, and basically that particular administration lives from council meeting to council meeting, and at every council meeting it can become chaos, then soon you can end up in a situation where there's a dissolution and then an election. But it's not a matter of immediately after the 14 days. I think that'd be way too soon.
Yeah. I mean, you've got a challenge, for example, in a municipality that is not a hung municipality, where the DA won an outright majority of 47% or so, where there is a current suspended municipal manager who's supposed to preside over the first council meeting, right? And they've just collapsed that particular meeting, and it's not happening. That is not even a hung municipality. How difficult will be the process of setting up a council meeting in a hung municipality, and how will that impact service delivery?
Yeah, no, because the fact that you don't have a coalition problems doesn't mean you don't have governance problems. We've had many councils across the country with outright majorities in serious governance difficulties. And that has to do with internal factionalism, disagreements, legal disputes, suspended municipal managers, coming and going of suspensions, etc. So in some of these municipalities, regardless of whether or not there's a coalition, it can be utter chaos. And it has to do with the fact that many of our councillors, too many councillors and too many officials are in it for the wrong reasons and pursuing their own interest and are driving factionalism, and that spills over into governance. So even without coalitions, you can have that problem, as we're seeing in some municipalities right now.
All right, let's take a break. We'll continue with some more analysis tonight here on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. Welcome back. You're in Focus, Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. It's a tough negotiation that we are seeing so far, with a lot of the preconditions that parties have put forward coming out to bear, and of course creating some difficulty in the formation of those coalitions. We've got with us Richard Jurgens, Professor Steven Friedman, as well as Jaap de Visser, and they're helping us in this conversation. Where the preconditions, Richard, on principle? Are they playing hardball on principle, or is this really for their own stomachs, right? For example, you've got a party that is willing to just say, as long as we've got a seat at the table, as long as we are given some municipality to govern at this particular point, to give our people jobs right now, we will not wait for a thing of 2024.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear the first part
I'm
of that.
saying, are the parties playing hardball on principle?
Right. Yeah. Look, at GGA, we've looked at the performance of the local councils. We have a performance index that indicates that, you know, their ranking. 9 of the top 10 are DA, 10 of the top, or 10 of the bottom, or 9 of the last are ANC, and 1 is IFP. But that doesn't indicate a total difference in governance style or standard across the parties. Our survey showed that really, in many respects, the level of the state of governance is mostly related to the density of population and the locality of the province. The parties, of course, do have an influence, but it's, in our understanding, not a direct one in terms of the overall levels of governance. And to pick up what Professor Friedman was saying earlier, the logic of the situation now that's been revealed by the local elections, and I emphasize the logic of it, is that as the 2 largest parties, representing about 67% of the vote of this last election, should get into a coalition and start trying to find each other and start trying to address the issues that the voters have clearly let them know are there. And our reading of that is basically services.
Yeah. So, I mean,
services are lacking. And they want, I think, you know, who's to say what's in the minds of individual voters, but looking at patterns, we would say that really the logic of the situation, as Professor Friedman indicated before, is a coalition. Whether the parties are prepared to grandstand and play principle to the last point or beyond is something we'll have to see. But we're calling for a greater and a more we're calling for a kind of pragmatism that has at the interests of the greater good at heart, and not only the individual parties. I think another part of our analysis is that the parties often negotiate as organizations rather than as representatives of the people they claim to represent. And, you know, a coalition, I think, would be a demand on both parties to think a little more widely.
At that practical level, Richard, I mean, are all municipalities good for coalitions, or are some that would require a downright majority?
Well, that's a tricky question, because each locality differs in terms of the composition of the coalition that has been operating up to now, and we're likely to see many more changes across the country. That's one of the patterns that's emerging, that voters have, to a significant degree, selected smaller or local or hyper-local parties, as some people have described them. What that shows is that South Africans, too, are getting together and trying to find alternatives to the great hegemon.
Yeah. And
that, I think, is a very encouraging sign. Very encouraging indeed. It's certainly the opposite of people just sitting and waiting for something to happen. So, and it's certainly changing the landscape a lot. But you know, our experience of coalitions until now has been unfortunate. Many of them have been described as unstable, partly because the partners involved have been so distant from each other ideologically, partly because some of those partners have also played opportunistic politics regardless of principle. So those coalitions have been unstable. What we could say is that perhaps what's emerging is the necessity of learning to work with coalitions, and that out of this process, which will essentially be a second wave of coalition finding in the country, perhaps some lessons will have been learned. It's also possible to learn lessons from the formation of coalitions in other countries,
yeah,
and why it happens. So I think that we've still got some lessons to learn. But if we do learn those lessons, coalitions are likely to become a more standard part of our politics.
Yeah. Professor Friedman, while on that question of coalitions happening everywhere, I mean, people normally that I've heard anyway so far like to point to the German coalition of Angela Merkel. It's in my understanding, a few parties that form that coalition, as opposed to in the South African context, where the opposition are saying we are negotiating with 8 political parties and community movements over these coalitions. Does it make it a little bit more difficult?
Well, the German situation which people are describing is really the sort of, I suppose, the situation Richard Jurgens is talking about. I mean, in Germany for the last few years, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, which are the two biggest parties, have been jointly in government together. But Germany is a very different place. It's a lot less polarized. I can see the argument for an ANC-DA coalition. On the other hand, I guess on one side of the fence, you then have to go and tell your voters, we told you that they were a bunch of corrupt knaves, and we put up posters saying it's either them or us, but now we're going into government with them. And the other side then has to say, well, we told you that they died in the world racists, but we're going into a coalition with them. It's not easy to sell that to your supporters if you're one of the bigger parties. I think our problem in this, we're sort of talking about coalitions as though there's a lot more, there's a lot greater menu than there really is. Coalitions are driven so much by simply, things which the larger parties would prefer never happen. And that's not just the ANC. Of course, the ANC wants to govern alone. But so does the DA, and that's why the DA puts up posters saying it's either us or the ANC, and tells its voters that if you vote for any other opposition party, you're splitting the opposition vote, which of course in our electoral system isn't true. It's a reflection of our politics, and it becomes a question of what is possible. And my source of there's nothing any of us can do about it. I mean, I keep on pointing to this hole in the middle of our politics. If we had a party in this country people who'd voted ANC in the past felt that they could transfer their vote to, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation, because that other party would be either governing on its own or forming coalitions with other parties. But we have the reality we have. And in that reality, I think a great deal of pragmatism and many coalitions of convenience are the only way you can govern. And that doesn't seem to be the political mood at the moment.
Yeah. Is this an opportunity, but though, for smaller parties, even newer parties, to gain mayorship in probably smaller, maybe not metros, but smaller municipalities, and have a go at it, and I suppose have some kind of budget that they control, and therefore be able to dispense their own patronage to their own people?
Well, I don't think, and this did come up in the negotiations, I don't think there's terribly much appetite among voters for this situation where a party which won 10% of the vote chooses the executive mayor. I think there's a problem with that. But yes, I mean, certainly there are. I mean, you've got the example, well, I suppose in their context, not a small party, but you've got the Cederberg example in the Western Cape, where a businessman there formed a sort of local political organization or civic organization, and he's going to be the mayor. That's because his organization won a lot of votes in Cederberg. But certainly people are propelled into positions, beyond their party's support. I mean, in Joburg, it's still not out of the question that Herman Mashaba, whose party got 16%, will be the mayor. And the party's coalition party, who got 30-something%, will be content with that. So it does happen in some cases. But only in coalitions. You see, the problem with the EFF demand was that they wanted to govern Tshwane alone with 10% of the vote. And, I really don't think voters were available for that option.
Yeah, preconditions, Jaap, and the lack of flexibility, which Professor Friedman is alluding to in terms of ideological differences, but also the parties, are they playing hardball on principle? What's your analysis?
No, I think we're in a real conundrum, and I think we have to see whether our sort of fairly crude politics is going to give way to more pragmatism that is really needed in a coalition context. And for as long as we have to live with the current electoral system, which may throw out these sort of more plural results, we're going to have to live with the reality of coalitions and perhaps start living by some traditions, some customs, that have developed in countries that have been practicing coalitions for many, many years. Like, for example, maybe it should be the biggest party that delivers a mayor. Maybe that is the starting point. And only if that doesn't work out, do the smaller ones get a bite of the cherry. At the moment, we seem to be rushing towards appeasing the kingmaker, because already kingmakers are walking away with mayoral chains and speakers' hammers all over the country. It's great for them, and it's a wonderful extra, great full-time office bearer that they secure, and the patronage that comes with it. But is it sustainable, and is it what the voters wanted? The voters didn't really want these kingmakers to be in the driver's seat, but the coalition negotiations take them there. And I think it's a bit, the bigger parties must maybe, I don't know, grow a spine and stare some of these kingmakers down and say, listen, we're not going to fall for this. You're not going to get the biggest seat, because you don't have enough seats to really make that happen. But at the moment, I think the kingmakers drive a very hard bargain and succeed. In the Western Cape, we've already seen that. So we need to develop some of these practices and customs. For example, also develop a good coalition agreements that are not just sort of an overall vague statement, but actually deal with a plan for that municipality and make them public, so that it's more difficult to walk away from a coalition agreement. And these are, I think, small things that can change and that can perhaps make a difference going forward.
Are the preconditions, for example, put by the Democratic Alliance going to come back and bite them? For example, in certain places, I mean, the big one being that we will not work with the ANC under no condition. And you have, for example, a possibility of getting the seats of the Patriotic Alliance, who are already in some kind of negotiations with the ANC. They're saying the EFF negotiations fell apart with Action SA because they were bringing the ANC along. Are these preconditions going to come back to bite them at some point?
Look, maybe I'm also naive, just like Steven, in that I would have hoped that there is a bit more local input here. Are these negotiations really driven by how much do we hate each other at the top, and that determines because at the local level there may very well be communities that say, well, ANC and DA, we can actually make a plan together, despite the fact that our regional or national leadership is at each other's throat. We can actually make a plan, and it has happened before. In Kanaland in the Western Cape, the ANC and the DA were at some point in a coalition. And so I think we also need to move towards a system where the national and regional party leaderships can perhaps let go a little bit and allow local activists, local community leaders, and local party bosses to also have a go at seeing what's possible in that locality. But again, maybe I'm naive. Maybe that's not what our politics is like.
Yes, I would share that. If I can just add,
yes,
I would share that view. The problem to overcome there, among other things, is the ANC's so-called democratic centralism. I can't see them giving up central control, which I think, as Jaap indicates, is one of the things they absolutely need to do. So I think that what these elections have fascinatingly revealed is a lot of new splits in our political landscape. I mean, certainly I would never have thought that we would have so many serious contenders among small, independent and local parties as we have this time. And I think that indicates the beginnings of a real nuance in voters' thinking that perhaps the leaders of the larger parties have simply fallen behind. And I think that, as Jaap indicates, one of the indications there is that people are starting to think more locally and about solving their problems themselves as communities. And that's effectively going to say to national government, well, what can you do for us? Because otherwise we're going to do it.
Gentlemen, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for your analysis tonight. Richard Jurgens, Professor Steven Friedman, and Jaap de Visser helping us in that conversation.